The moment Captain Marcus Thompson's hand struck Naomi Richards's face in first class, he had no idea he'd just assaulted the woman who owned 73% of Atlantic Airways. What happened next would shake the aviation industry forever and expose the ugly truth about discrimination at 30,000 feet. This is the story of how one slap destroyed a career, launched a revolution, and proved that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones you least expect. Follow this incredible journey to the end and comment on your city below so I can see how far this story has traveled around the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across Terminal C at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport as Naomi Richards adjusted the worn strap of her canvas messenger bag and glanced at her boarding pass. Flight 847 to San Francisco, first class seat 2A. She'd deliberately chosen the most inconspicuous outfit in her wardrobe. Faded jeans, a simple gray hoodie from her Stanford days, and beaten-up white sneakers that had seen better years. To the casual observer, she looked like any other 28-year-old, traveling on someone else's dime, perhaps a grad student or junior consultant whose company had splurged on a premium ticket. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 years ago, through a complex web of shell corporations and private equity partnerships, she'd quietly acquired controlling interest in Atlantic Airways, 73% to be exact. The airline's board remained blissfully unaware that their mysterious major shareholder, listed only as Meridian Holdings LLC, was a young black woman who could have bought and sold most of them before breakfast. She preferred it that way. Anonymity was power, and power was something Naomi Richards understood better than most. "Good morning, ma'am. May I see your boarding pass?" The gate agent's smile was professional but perfunctory, her eyes already moving to the next passenger in line. "Of course." Naomi handed over the pass, noting how the woman's demeanor shifted slightly when she saw the first-class designation. It was subtle, a barely perceptible straightening of posture, a more attentive focus, but Naomi caught it. She always did. "Have a wonderful flight, Ms. Richards. Boarding will begin in about 10 minutes. As Naomi found a seat in the waiting area, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through the morning's reports from her various business interests. The tech startup she'd founded at 24 Neuralink Dynamics had just closed another round of Series D funding, pushing its valuation past the $12 billion mark. Her real estate portfolio had expanded by 3 properties in the past week, and Atlantic Airways, despite its aging fleet and outdated customer service protocols, was showing promising quarterly numbers. She'd been planning this trip for months, a chance to visit the company's San Francisco hub and observe operations from the ground level. None of the West Coast management team knew who she really was, of course. As far as they were concerned, she was just another consultant from McKinsey, sent to evaluate operational efficiency. It was the perfect cover. "Attention passengers, we will now begin boarding Flight 847 to San Francisco. We invite our first-class passengers and members with Platinum Elite status to board at this time." Naomi gathered her belongings and joined the small group moving toward the gate. She recognized the type immediately, mostly middle-aged white men in expensive suits, a few women who carried themselves with the particular confidence that came from corner offices and stock options. She was the youngest person in the group by at least 15 years, and certainly the only one dressed like she'd just rolled out of a college dorm. The flight attendant at the gate, her name tag read Jennifer, smiled warmly as Naomi approached. "Welcome aboard, miss. Right this way to first class." "Thank you," Naomi replied, following Jennifer down the jet bridge. She could feel eyes on her back and resisted the urge to turn around. Let them wonder. Let them make their assumptions. She'd learned long ago that people's prejudices were often their greatest weakness. The aircraft was one of Atlantic Airways' newer models, a Boeing 787, that still carried that new plane smell of leather and industrial cleaning products. First class was configured in a 2-2 layout, 12 seats total, each one more spacious than most people's home offices. Naomi's seat 2A was by the window on the left side of the aircraft. As she settled in, storing her bag in the overhead compartment, she became aware of a presence behind her. A shadow fell across her seat, and she turned to see a man in his late 40s studying her with unconcealed interest. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair perfectly styled, and sharp blue eyes that seemed to be cataloging every detail of her appearance. His uniform identified him as a captain, 4 gold stripes on his shoulders, catching the cabin light. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "I'm Captain Marcus Thompson. I don't believe I've seen you in first class before." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Naomi recognized the game immediately. She'd been playing variations of it her entire life. The polite inquiry that wasn't really polite. The assumption that she needed to justify her presence, the casual assertion of his right to question her. "I don't fly this route regularly," she replied, evenly settling into her seat and reaching for her seatbelt. "Is there something I can help you with, Captain?" Marcus's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "Just making sure all our passengers are comfortable. Sometimes there can be confusion about seating assignments. I'd hate for there to be any embarrassment later." The implication was clear, but Naomi had dealt with far more sophisticated attempts at intimidation. "I'm quite confident in my seat assignment, thank you. 2A, first class. Would you like to see my boarding pass?" "That won't be necessary," Marcus said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'm sure everything is in order. It's just that we've had some issues lately with passengers stretching the truth about their accommodations. You understand." Other passengers were beginning to board now, and Naomi was acutely aware that several were watching the interaction with varying degrees of interest. A woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, seat 4B according to the overhead display, looked concerned. A younger man with a press badge hanging from his neck was openly eavesdropping while pretending to organize his carry-on. "I appreciate your diligence, Captain," Naomi said, her voice carrying just enough edge to make her position clear without escalating the situation. "I'm sure we'll all have a pleasant flight." Marcus studied her for another moment, his jaw working slightly as if he were chewing on words he wanted to say, but couldn't quite justify. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Of course. Enjoy your flight, Miss Richards," Naomi supplied, though she didn't extend her hand. "Ms. Richards." He drew out her name as if testing its authenticity. "I'll be sure to keep an eye on things." With that, he turned and walked toward the cockpit, his shoulders rigid with barely contained displeasure. Naomi watched him go, filing away every detail of the interaction. Captain Marcus Thompson, she thought. She'd remember that name. As the boarding process continued, Naomi observed her fellow first-class passengers with growing interest. The woman in 4B introduced herself as Margaret O'Sullivan, a recently retired high school principal from Boston. Her warmth was genuine, and she seemed genuinely troubled by the captain's behavior. "That was rather odd," Margaret said quietly, leaning across the aisle. "I've never seen a pilot question a passenger's right to be in first class. Most unusual." The man with the press badge, James Morrison, according to his credential, had taken seat 3D and was making notes on his phone with the focused intensity of someone who smelled a story. He caught Naomi's eye and offered a sympathetic grimace. "Tech journalist for Digital Weekly," he said by way of introduction. "And that was some grade A BS, if you don't mind my saying so. I fly this route monthly, and I've never seen Thompson pull that routine with anyone else." Seat 1B was occupied by Bradley Hartwell, a pompous-looking man in his 50s, whose expensive suit couldn't quite disguise his soft physique. He'd watched the entire exchange with obvious approval, and when he caught Naomi's eye, his smile was smug and complicit. "First time in first class?" he asked with false friendliness. "It can be a bit overwhelming if you're not used to it. The captain's just making sure everyone feels comfortable." The woman in 3A was Elena Rodriguez, and the briefcase beside her and the legal documents spread across her tray table marked her as an attorney. She'd been watching the interaction with the sharp attention of someone trained to recognize discrimination when she saw it. "Civil rights law," she said quietly to Naomi, tapping a business card against her fingers. 20 years of experience. What just happened was completely inappropriate, and if you need someone to document it, I'm your person." Naomi accepted the card gratefully, but kept her expression neutral. "I appreciate that. Let's hope it was just a misunderstanding." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't. Captain Marcus Thompson had made his position clear from the moment he'd laid eyes on her. To him, she was an anomaly that needed to be explained, a disruption to the natural order of his first-class cabin. He'd probably convinced himself that he was protecting his real passengers from some kind of fraud or mistake. The irony was exquisite. If Marcus had known that the woman he'd just challenged owned not just the seat she was sitting in, but the entire aircraft, the airline, and technically his job, he might have approached the situation differently. Then again, Naomi thought grimly, maybe not. Prejudice had a way of making people remarkably resistant to facts. As the last passengers boarded and the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, Naomi settled back in her seat and tried to focus on the work awaiting her in San Francisco. She had meetings scheduled with the West Coast operations team, a tour of the maintenance facilities, and a private session with the customer service training department. All of it would be conducted under her McKinsey consultant cover, allowing her to see how the airline really functioned when the owner wasn't watching. But her attention kept drifting back to Captain Thompson, who had emerged from the cockpit for a final walk through the cabin. His demeanor was professional as he greeted the other first-class passengers, shaking hands with Bradley Hartwell and engaging in brief but warm conversation with Margaret O'Sullivan. When he reached Naomi's row, however, his entire bearing shifted. "Everything satisfactory, Ms. Richards?" He asked, his tone suggesting that satisfaction was neither expected nor particularly welcome. "Perfectly, thank you," Naomi replied without looking up from her phone. "Excellent. I do hope you'll remember that first class comes with certain expectations, standards of behavior that we like to maintain." This time, Naomi did look up, meeting his gaze directly. "What kind of standards did you have in mind, Captain?" Marcus's smile was cold. "Oh, I think you know. Respect for the space, consideration for other passengers, understanding that not everyone is used to this level of service. Sometimes people can get a bit carried away when they find themselves in unfamiliar circumstances." The condescension was breathtaking in its obviousness, and Naomi felt a familiar surge of anger rise in her chest. But she'd learned long ago that the best way to handle men like Marcus Thompson was to let them reveal themselves completely before responding. "I'll be sure to keep that in mind," she said mildly. "Thank you for the advice." Marcus nodded as if her compliance was exactly what he'd expected. "Of course. We're here to help if you need anything," explained. As he walked away, Naomi became aware that the entire first-class cabin had gone quiet. Every passenger was now acutely aware that something was happening, though the exact nature of the conflict remained unspoken. The flight attendants, too, had noticed the tension, though they seemed uncertain about how to address it. Jennifer, the flight attendant who had welcomed Naomi aboard, approached with a concerned expression. "Is everything all right, Ms. Richards? You seem tense." "I'm fine, thank you," Naomi replied, though she appreciated the woman's genuine concern. Just an interesting conversation with the captain. Captain Thompson can be a bit old school, Jennifer said diplomatically. He's been with the airline for 23 years. Sometimes he has strong opinions about how things should be done. 23 years, Naomi noted. That meant he'd started with Atlantic Airways before the company's current incarnation, back when it was still Eastern Regional and served mostly domestic routes. He'd seen the airline change hands multiple times, modernize its fleet, and expand internationally. In his mind, he probably saw himself as a guardian of its traditions and standards. The problem was that his standards appeared to include some very specific ideas about who belonged in first class and who didn't. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, Naomi found herself thinking about the broader implications of what she'd just witnessed. This wasn't just about one prejudiced pilot. It was about the culture that had allowed someone like Marcus Thompson to rise to a position of authority and maintain it for over 2 decades. How many other passengers had he treated this way? How many complaints had been filed and subsequently buried? How many people had simply accepted his behavior as the price of flying? The airline she owned, she realized, had a serious problem, and she was probably the only person in a position to fix it. The engines spooled up as they reached the runway, and Captain Thompson's voice came over the intercom with the standard pre-flight announcement. His tone was crisp and professional, the voice of a man completely in control of his domain. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Thompson speaking. We've been cleared for takeoff, and we're expecting a smooth flight to San Francisco today. Flight time will be approximately 5 hours and 40 minutes with clear skies most of the way. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure." As the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into the morning sky, Naomi stared out the window at the shrinking landscape below. Somewhere down there in a nondescript office building in downtown D.C. was the headquarters of Meridian Holdings, LLC, the shell company, through which she controlled Atlantic Airways. The lawyers and accountants who managed her affairs were probably having their morning meetings right now, completely unaware that their boss was currently being discriminated against by one of her own employees. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on her. She could have ended Marcus Thompson's career with a single phone call. She could have had him removed from the aircraft. Before takeoff, could have launched an investigation that would have destroyed not just his job, but his entire reputation in the aviation industry. The power was literally at her fingertips. But that would have been too easy, and it wouldn't have solved the real problem. If she wanted to understand how deep the rot went, she needed to see how far Marcus Thompson was willing to take his discrimination. She needed to document not just his behavior, but the reaction of his colleagues and the airline's systems. Most importantly, she needed to see whether anyone else would stand up to him. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign clicked off, Naomi settled back in her seat and opened her laptop. She had work to do both for her cover story and for her real mission. But she also had a feeling that this flight was going to be far more eventful than she'd originally planned. Captain Marcus Thompson had picked the wrong passenger to mess with. He just didn't know it yet. The flight attendants began their service, starting with the first-class cabin. When Jennifer reached Naomi's seat, her smile was warm, but her eyes were still concerned. "What can I get you to drink, Ms. Richards?" "Just water, please. Still no ice." "Of course. And would you like to see our breakfast menu? Chef Patterson has prepared some wonderful options for this morning's flight." Naomi accepted the menu and was surprised by the quality of the offerings. Atlantic Airways had clearly invested in upgrading their food service, though she couldn't remember approving that particular budget item. She made a mental note to review the hospitality division's recent expenditures. As she studied the menu, she became aware of a conversation happening behind her. Bradley Hartwell was speaking to Margaret O'Sullivan in a voice just loud enough to be overheard. "It's really a shame what's happened to air travel," he was saying. "Used to be that first class meant something. Now they'll put anyone up here if they've got the money. No consideration for the experience of the other passengers." Margaret's response was crisp. "I'm not sure what you mean by anyone, Mr. Hartwell. That young woman seems perfectly pleasant to me." "Oh, I'm sure she's nice enough." Bradley continued, his tone dripping with false reasonableness. "It's just that some people aren't used to this level of service. They don't understand the etiquette. You know, it can make things uncomfortable for everyone else." Elena Rodriguez turned in her seat, her expression sharp. "Are you suggesting that someone's race determines their ability to behave appropriately on an airplane?" "I didn't say anything about race," Bradley protested, though his flush suggested he knew exactly what he'd implied. "I'm talking about class, about understanding how to conduct oneself in certain environments." "Which is code for what exactly, Elena pressed. "Because from where I'm sitting, the only person making anyone uncomfortable is you." The exchange was interrupted by Captain Thompson's return to the cabin. He walked slowly through first class, ostensibly checking on passenger comfort, but clearly monitoring the conversation. When he reached Bradley's seat, he stopped. "Everything all right back here?" he asked, his tone suggesting sympathy for Bradley's position. "Oh yes, Captain," Bradley replied. "We were just discussing the evolution of air travel, how things have changed over the years." Marcus nodded knowingly. "Indeed they have. Sometimes not for the better, I'm afraid. Standards aren't what they used to be." He glanced meaningfully at Naomi, who was pretending to focus on her laptop while actually recording every word of the conversation. The digital recorder app on her phone was capturing everything, creating a permanent record of what was rapidly becoming a textbook case of in-flight discrimination. "Still," Marcus continued, "we do our best to maintain certain expectations. Some passengers need more guidance than others." Margaret O'Sullivan looked appalled. "Captain, are you seriously suggesting that you treat passengers differently based on your personal assumptions about their background?" Marcus's smile was patronizing. "Of course not, ma'am. We treat all passengers with the utmost respect. It's just that respect sometimes means helping people understand what's expected of them in unfamiliar situations." "And who determines what's expected?" Elena Rodriguez interjected, her lawyer instincts clearly engaged. "Because I've reviewed the Federal Aviation Administration's regulations on passenger treatment, and I don't recall any provisions for guidance based on a crew member's subjective assessment of someone's social class." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus's expression hardened, and for the first time his professional veneer cracked slightly. "I've been flying for Atlantic Airways for 23 years, he said stiffly. "I think I understand how to manage my cabin." "Your cabin?" Naomi looked up from her laptop, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I wasn't aware that pilots owned the aircraft they flew." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus turned to face her fully, his blue eyes flashing with anger at being questioned by someone he clearly considered beneath his notice. "It's a figure of speech," he said through gritted teeth. "As captain of this aircraft, I am responsible for the safety and comfort of all passengers. That includes maintaining appropriate standards of behavior." "Whose behavior are you concerned about exactly?" Naomi asked, closing her laptop and giving him her full attention. "Because from my perspective, the only inappropriate behavior I've witnessed has come from airline staff." A collective intake of breath swept through the first-class cabin. James Morrison had his phone out now, not even pretending to hide the fact that he was recording. Margaret O'Sullivan looked like she wanted to applaud. Elena Rodriguez was taking notes. Only Bradley Hartwell seemed pleased by the escalation. "Now see here," he said, standing up, despite the fact that the seatbelt sign was still on. "Captain Thompson is just trying to maintain order. Some people need to learn their place." The words fell like a bomb into the already tense atmosphere. Elena Rodriguez stood up as well, her face flushed with anger. "Did you just tell a fellow passenger to learn her place in 2025 on a commercial flight?" "I think everyone needs to calm down," Jennifer, the flight attendant, interjected, moving quickly down the aisle. "Perhaps we should all take our seats and—" "No," Naomi said firmly, standing up herself. "I think it's time we addressed what's really happening here." She was tall, nearly 6 feet in her sneakers, and her presence filled the space around her with an authority that had nothing to do with uniforms or job titles. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who was used to being the most powerful person in any room. "Captain Thompson, since the moment I boarded this aircraft, you have questioned my right to be here, implied that I don't understand proper behavior, and suggested that I need guidance to function in first class. Mr. Hartwell has openly suggested that people like me don't belong here and should learn our place. I'm curious, what exactly is it about me that makes you both so uncomfortable?" Marcus Thompson's face was red now, his carefully maintained composure cracking under the pressure of direct confrontation. "I don't like your tone," he said, his voice rising. "I'm the captain of this aircraft, and I won't be spoken to that way by a passenger who doesn't even what?" Naomi interrupted. "Doesn't even what, Captain?" The question hung in the air like a live wire. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it clearly, struggling with words he wanted to say, but knew he shouldn't. "Doesn't even belong here," Bradley Hartwell finished for him. "Let's just say it. We all know what this is about. Some people buy a first-class ticket and think it makes them something they're not." "And what am I not exactly?" Naomi asked, her voice deadly quiet. The silence that followed was deafening. Every passenger in first class was watching now, and several from economy had craned their necks to see what was happening. The flight attendants looked paralyzed, clearly out of their depth with a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond their training. It was Marcus Thompson who finally broke. The weight of command, the pressure of maintaining his authority in front of passengers who were clearly not buying his act, and perhaps 23 years of unchecked prejudice finally boiled over. "You don't belong here," he snarled, stepping closer to Naomi. "I don't care what ticket you bought or what lies you told to get it. This is first class, and we have standards. Standards that you clearly don't understand." "What standards are those?" Naomi asked, not backing down an inch. "Standards of behavior, of respect, of knowing your place in the world," Marcus shot back. "Standards that apparently aren't taught wherever you come from." The racism was naked now, stripped of all pretense and euphemism. Elena Rodriguez was furiously writing notes. James Morrison's phone was capturing every word. Margaret O'Sullivan looked like she might be sick. But Naomi just smiled. It was a cold, calculating expression that would have terrified Marcus Thompson if he'd been smart enough to recognize it. "I see," she said softly. "And you feel qualified to determine whether I meet these standards?" "Damn right I do." Marcus replied, his authority complex now fully engaged. "I'm the captain of this aircraft, and what I say goes. If I decide you don't belong here, then you don't belong here." He reached out as if to grab her arm to physically enforce his authority over a passenger who had dared to challenge him. It was exactly the kind of escalation Naomi had been waiting for, the moment when his discrimination crossed the line into something actionable, something that no airline could ignore or excuse. But what happened next surprised everyone, including Naomi herself. Marcus Thompson, captain of Atlantic Airways Flight 847, pulled back his hand and slapped Naomi Richards across the face. The sound of skin striking skin cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. For a moment, the entire aircraft seemed to hold its breath. Passengers froze in their seats. Flight attendants stood paralyzed. Even the engine noise seemed to fade into the background. Naomi's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, her cheek already beginning to redden. But when she turned back to face Marcus Thompson, her expression was one of triumph rather than pain. Because in that single shocking moment of violence, Captain Marcus Thompson had done something far more valuable than he could possibly imagine. He had just assaulted the owner of Atlantic Airways in front of a cabin full of witnesses on a flight that was being live-streamed to social media, with a civil rights attorney taking notes and a tech journalist recording every second. He had just ended his career, destroyed his reputation, and handed Naomi Richards the perfect justification for the complete overhaul of Atlantic Airways that she'd been planning for months. Most importantly, he had just proven that the problems at her airline ran far deeper than she'd ever imagined, and that the time for subtle corporate changes had passed. As Naomi Richards stood there in the first-class cabin of her own aircraft, her cheek stinging from a slap delivered by her own employee, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt angry. Genuinely, righteously angry. And when Naomi Richards got angry, empires trembled. The reckoning was about to begin. The silence that followed the slap seemed to stretch into eternity, though in reality, it lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then the cabin erupted into chaos. "Jesus Christ!" James Morrison shouted, his phone still recording, as passengers around him gasped and recoiled. Did that just happen? Did he just hit her? Elena Rodriguez was already on her feet, her legal training kicking in automatically. "I need everyone to stay exactly where they are," she called out, her voice cutting through the pandemonium. "Nobody move. This is now a crime scene." Margaret O'Sullivan had her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "In all my years, I've never seen anything like this. Captain, what have you done?" But Marcus Thompson seemed frozen in place, his hand still raised from the blow, his face cycling through a range of emotions, anger, confusion, and finally dawning horror as he realized what he'd just done. The red mist of rage that had driven him to strike a passenger was clearing, and in its place came the cold reality of career suicide. She was... He stammered, looking around the cabin, as if seeing it for the first time. Every face was turned toward him, and none of them showed anything resembling support. Even Bradley Hartwell had gone pale, apparently recognizing that his new ally had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Naomi stood perfectly still, her hand slowly rising to touch her cheek where the blow had landed. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that made Marcus take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't pain or fear. It was the look of a predator that had just watched its prey walk willingly into a trap. "Jennifer," Naomi said quietly, never taking her eyes off Marcus, "I need you to contact your flight operations center immediately. Report that the captain has just committed assault against a passenger." The flight attendant stood frozen, her training manual having never covered this particular scenario. I don't know if I can. He's the captain, and he's also a criminal," Elena Rodriguez interjected sharply. "Ms. Richards, as your legal counsel, and yes, I'm officially representing you as of this moment, I advise you to document everything. James, please tell me you got that on video." James Morrison nodded grimly, his face lit by the glow of his phone screen. "Every second of it, and it's already uploading to the cloud. This is going to be everywhere in about 10 minutes. "Good," Elena said, pulling out her own phone. "I'm calling the FBI. Assault on an aircraft in flight is a federal crime." Marcus finally seemed to snap out of his stupor. "Now wait just a minute," he said, his voice shaking. This is my aircraft and I have the authority. You have the authority to hit passengers. Margaret O'Sullivan interrupted her decades of dealing with difficult students, lending steel to her voice. What kind of airline allows this behavior? The kind that's about to face the largest discrimination lawsuit in aviation history, Elena muttered, already dialing. FBI. Yes, I need to report a federal crime in progress. Naomi held up a hand, and something in her gesture made Elena pause. Before we involve federal law enforcement, she said, her voice carrying an odd note of calm authority. I think we should give Captain Thompson a chance to explain himself. Marcus looked at her with desperate hope, as if this might be his lifeline. Yes, exactly. This was all just a misunderstanding. I was trying to maintain order, and things got out of hand. These things happen. These things happen, Naomi repeated, tilting her head slightly. You regularly assault passengers who don't meet your personal standards. No, that's not what I meant. I meant that tensions can run high and sometimes what Captain... Naomi's voice was getting quieter, but somehow more menacing. Sometimes you lose control and strike black women who have the audacity to question your authority. The racial element laid bare and undeniable sent another shockwave through the cabin. Bradley Hartwell actually winced, finally understanding that his casual bigotry had helped fuel something far more serious than he'd intended. I never said anything about race, Marcus protested weakly. You didn't have to, James Morrison said, looking up from his phone. I've been documenting this entire interaction since boarding. From your first challenge of Ms. Richards' right to be in first class to Mr. Hartwell's comments about knowing your place, to your escalating hostility. The pattern is crystal clear. And now you've crossed the line from discrimination into felony assault, Elena added. Do you have any idea what you've just done to yourself, to this airline? Marcus was beginning to panic, now the full scope of his situation finally dawning on him. Look, we can work this out. Ms. Richards, I apologize. I lost my temper. It won't happen again. We don't need to make this into a bigger deal than it is. Naomi laughed, and the sound was like ice cracking. A bigger deal, Captain Thompson, you just assaulted a passenger in front of multiple witnesses on a commercial flight. You think this is something we can just sweep under the rug? I'm sure the airline will want to handle this internally, Marcus said desperately. They won't want the publicity. Bad for business, you know. They'll probably just transfer me maybe some sensitivity training. The naivety of the statement was breathtaking. Elena Rodriguez shook her head in amazement. Transfer you, Captain. You're going to be lucky if you're not in federal prison by the end of the week. Jennifer, the flight attendant, had been speaking quietly into the aircraft's communication system. She approached the group with visible reluctance. I've contacted operations, she said. They want to speak with the captain immediately. Marcus straightened, grasping at this last vestige of his authority. There you see, the airline will sort this out. They know I'm a good pilot, been with them for over 20 years. This will all blow over. He started toward the cockpit, but Naomi's voice stopped him cold. Captain Thompson, she said, and there was something in her tone that made everyone in the cabin turn to look at her. Before you take that call, there's something you should know about Atlantic Airways. Marcus paused, confused. What are you talking about? Naomi reached into her bag and pulled out a slim leather portfolio. From it, she extracted a single document, a stock certificate that looked official and very expensive. She held it up so that Marcus could see it clearly. I'm talking about ownership, she said quietly. Specifically, my ownership of 73% of Atlantic Airways stock through Meridian Holdings, LLC. The silence that followed was different from the shock after the slap. This was the silence of minds struggling to process information that didn't compute, of assumptions crumbling in real time. Marcus stared at the certificate as if it were written in a foreign language. That's impossible. You're some what? Naomi asked, raising an eyebrow. Some young black woman who couldn't possibly own an airline. Is that what you were going to say? Bradley Hartwell had gone white as a sheet. This has to be fake, he whispered. There's no way. Elena Rodriguez, meanwhile, was studying the document with professional interest. Holy shit, she breathed. This is real. The corporate seal, the registration numbers. Ms. Richards, are you telling us that you own this airline? Controlling interest, Naomi confirmed. Has been for about 3 years now. I prefer to keep a low profile, let the board think they're running things. But technically, yes, Captain Thompson just assaulted his boss. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He actually staggered backward, his face cycling through a dozen different emotions. No, he said weakly. No, that can't be right. The owners are… They're what? Naomi asked. Rich white men in expensive suits. Sorry to disappoint you. James Morrison let out a low whistle, his journalist instincts fully engaged now. This story just went from interesting to absolutely incredible. Do you have any idea what this means? It means, Elena said slowly, that we're not just dealing with passenger assault anymore. This is about systemic discrimination at the highest levels of a major corporation. Captain Thompson didn't just hit a random customer, he hit the owner of the company, and he did it because of her race. Margaret O'Sullivan was shaking her head in amazement. Young lady, I don't know whether to be impressed or terrified. You've been sitting here taking notes on your own airline. Sometimes the best way to understand how an organization really functions is to see it from the bottom up, Naomi replied. I had no idea things were this bad, but Captain Thompson has been very educational. Marcus was beginning to hyperventilate. This isn't happening, he muttered. This can't be happening. You're lying. This is some kind of setup. I assure you it's quite real, Naomi said, pulling out her phone. Would you like me to call the board of directors? I'm sure they'd be very interested to hear about how their senior captain treats passengers. Wait, Marcus said, holding up his hands. Just wait. We can fix this. I'll apologize publicly, take whatever punishment you want. Just please don't destroy my career over one mistake. The desperation in his voice was palpable, but Naomi's expression remained unmoved. One mistake, she repeated. Captain, this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was the culmination of systematic discrimination that you've probably been practicing for years. How many other passengers have you treated this way? How many complaints have been filed and ignored? How many people have simply accepted your behavior because they didn't have the power to fight back? I don't, Marcus stammered. Because I do have that power, Naomi continued, her voice gaining strength. And I'm going to use it. Not just to punish you, but to fix the culture that allowed someone like you to rise to a position of authority in my company. Elena Rodriguez was nodding approvingly. This is exactly the kind of case that changes industries. A clear pattern of discrimination culminating in assault, documented by multiple witnesses, with the victim being the actual owner of the company. No airline executive in the country will be able to ignore this. The media coverage alone will be massive. James Morrison added, his fingers flying over his phone screen. I'm already getting calls from other journalists. This is going to be front-page news. Marcus looked around the cabin desperately, as if searching for allies who might help him salvage the situation. But Bradley Hartwell was studiously avoiding eye contact. The flight attendants were maintaining professional distance, and the other passengers were looking at him with varying degrees of disgust and disbelief. "Ms. Richards," he said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I have a family, a mortgage, kids in college. If you destroy me over this, you're not just hurting me, you're hurting them too." For a moment, Naomi's expression softened slightly. Then she shook her head. "You should have thought about that before you decided to assault me, Captain. Actions have consequences, and some lines can't be uncrossed." "But surely we can work something out," Marcus pressed. "Some kind of settlement, maybe sensitivity training, community service. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." "What would make this right," Naomi said coldly, "is ensuring that no other passenger ever has to endure what I just experienced. And the only way to do that is to make an example that sends a clear message throughout the industry." Elena Rodriguez looked up from her legal notes. "Ms. Richards, I strongly advise you to pursue both criminal and civil action. The criminal charges will establish the facts, and the civil suit will provide the financial incentive for real change." "I agree," Naomi said. "But first I think we need to address the immediate situation. Captain Thompson, you're relieved of duty effective immediately." Marcus's face went gray. "You can't do that. I'm the captain of this aircraft. Federal aviation regulations require a competent pilot in command," Naomi interrupted. "They say nothing about maintaining someone who has just committed a felony. I'm sure your first officer is perfectly capable of completing this flight." She turned to Jennifer. "Please inform the first officer that Captain Thompson is no longer in command of this aircraft. I'll take full responsibility for that decision with the FAA." Jennifer nodded numbly, clearly overwhelmed by the rapid turn of events. As she headed toward the cockpit, Marcus made one last desperate play. "This is mutiny," he declared, trying to summon some vestige of his former authority. "I'm still the legal captain of this flight, and I order everyone to return to their seats and stop interfering with my command." The attempt at asserting dominance fell completely flat. Elena Rodriguez actually laughed. "Mutiny, Captain, you just assaulted the owner of the airline. You have no authority here anymore." "Besides," James Morrison added, "this whole thing is being live-streamed to social media. Half the internet has already seen you hit her. You're done." As if summoned by his words, Marcus's phone began buzzing insistently. He looked at it with growing horror as text messages and missed calls poured in. His face went white as he apparently recognized some of the numbers. "Oh God," he whispered. "They already know. The airline, my union rep, my wife." He looked up at Naomi with naked desperation. "Please, you have to help me. This is going to ruin everything." "You ruined everything," Naomi replied without sympathy. "The moment you decided that your prejudices were more important than basic human decency." Margaret O'Sullivan, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up. "Captain, I've spent 40 years in education, dealing with people from every background imaginable. In all that time, I've learned one fundamental truth: respect is earned, not demanded. You never showed Ms. Richards an ounce of respect, and now you're asking her to show you mercy you don't deserve." "The lady's right," said a new voice from the economy section. A middle-aged black man had stood up and was looking toward the first-class cabin. "We could hear everything from back here." "That was disgraceful, Captain. Absolutely disgraceful." Other economy passengers were standing now, craning their necks to see what was happening. Word was spreading through the aircraft like wildfire, and the mood was turning increasingly hostile toward Marcus. "Sit down," Marcus shouted, his panic making him even more aggressive. "All of you sit down. I'm still the captain of this aircraft." "No," Naomi said firmly. "You're not." She stood up to her full height and addressed the entire cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Naomi Richards, and I own Atlantic Airways. What you've just witnessed is completely unacceptable and does not represent the values of this company. Captain Thompson has been relieved of duty, and we will be conducting a full investigation into this incident. The announcement sent another wave of shock through the passengers. Conversations erupted as people tried to process what they'd just heard. Several passengers were now openly recording with their phones, despite flight attendant requests to put devices away. Marcus looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "This is insane," he muttered. "This whole thing is insane. I'm a good pilot. I've never had an incident, never failed a check ride, 23 years of safe flying. And you threw it all away because you couldn't stand the idea of a black woman in first class," Elena Rodriguez observed. "Was it worth it, Captain? Was maintaining your sense of racial superiority worth destroying your entire life?" The blunt assessment seemed to break something in Marcus. He slumped into an empty seat, his face in his hands. "I don't know what happened," he said quietly. When I saw her sitting there looking so out of place, I don't know what I thought." "You thought she didn't belong," Naomi said. "Just like Mr. Hartwell thought I should know my place. Just like you've probably thought about dozens of other passengers over the years." Bradley Hartwell, who had been trying to make himself invisible, suddenly stood up. "Now wait just a minute," he said, his face flushed with anger. "I'm not taking the blame for his actions. What he did was wrong, but I never told him to hit anyone." "No," Elena Rodriguez agreed. "You just created the atmosphere that made him feel justified in escalating. Your comments about standards and knowing your place gave him permission to see Ms. Richards as less than human." "That's ridiculous," Bradley protested. "I was talking about class, not race." "Same thing in your mind," James Morrison said, looking up from his phone. "Dog whistle politics 101. You can't claim ignorance when the subtext was that obvious." Naomi was watching the exchange with clinical interest, as if studying specimens under a microscope. "Mr. Hartwell," she said finally, "what company do you work for?" Bradley's face went pale. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I'm going to be conducting a thorough review of everyone who contributed to this situation. If your employer has contracts with Atlantic Airways, they're going to want to know how their representative behaved on this flight." "You can't do that," Bradley said weakly. "This has nothing to do with my job." "Doesn't it?" Naomi asked. "You used your position as a fellow first-class passenger to validate Captain Thompson's discrimination. You made it clear that you shared his views about who belongs in this cabin. That absolutely has something to do with how you conduct yourself professionally." Elena Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Discrimination isn't just a legal issue, it's a business risk. Companies are increasingly careful about employees who demonstrate prejudice, especially in public settings." Bradley looked around the cabin desperately, as if hoping to find support from other passengers, but the faces staring back at him were universally unsympathetic. Even the flight attendants, who had initially tried to maintain neutrality, were clearly disgusted by what they'd witnessed. "This is getting out of hand," he said finally. "All I did was make a few comments. I didn't hit anyone." "You enabled someone who did," Margaret O'Sullivan said firmly. "You created an environment where Captain Thompson felt comfortable expressing his prejudices. You share responsibility for what happened here." As the confrontation continued, Naomi's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and smiled grimly. "Excuse me," she said to the group. "I need to take this." She answered with a professional tone that was completely at odds with the chaos surrounding her. "Naomi Richards speaking." "Ms. Richards, this is David Chen, CEO of Atlantic Airways. I've just received some very disturbing reports about Flight 847. Can you confirm what's happening?" The irony of the situation was delicious. David Chen had no idea he was talking to his actual boss. The shell corporation structure that hid Naomi's ownership meant that even the airline's CEO didn't know who really controlled the company. "I can confirm that Captain Marcus Thompson has just committed assault against a passenger," Naomi said calmly, in front of multiple witnesses, including a journalist and a civil rights attorney. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Assault. Are you certain Captain Thompson is one of our most senior pilots?" "I'm certain because I'm the passenger he assaulted," Naomi replied. "And before you ask, yes, it was racially motivated, and yes, it's been recorded." Another pause, longer this time. "Oh God," Chen whispered. "This is going to destroy us. The media coverage, the lawsuits, the federal investigation. We'll be lucky if we survive this." "That depends," Naomi said, glancing around the cabin at the faces watching her with fascination, "on how the company responds. This incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It's the result of a culture that has allowed discrimination to flourish unchecked." "What do you want?" Chen asked desperately. "I mean, what would it take to minimize the damage?" Naomi smiled, and it was the expression of someone who had just been handed exactly the opportunity she'd been waiting for. "Mr. Chen, I think we need to have a much longer conversation about the future of Atlantic Airways. But first, you need to handle the immediate crisis." "Of course, absolutely. What do you need?" "I need Captain Thompson removed from duty immediately and turned over to federal authorities when we land. I need a full investigation into the airline's discrimination policies and training procedures, and I need a personal guarantee that this kind of incident will never happen again." "Done," Chen said quickly. "Whatever it takes. We'll cooperate fully with any investigation, and we'll implement whatever changes are necessary." "Good," Naomi said. "But understand this, I'm not going away quietly. This incident has shown me that Atlantic Airways has serious institutional problems, and I intend to see them fixed." "I understand completely," Chen replied. "We'll do whatever it takes to make this right." As Naomi ended the call, she became aware that the entire first-class cabin was staring at her with a mixture of awe and fear. She had just dictated terms to the CEO of a major airline as if she were discussing the weather. Marcus Thompson looked up from his hands, his face streaked with tears. "You're really going to destroy me, aren't you?" he said quietly. Naomi considered the question seriously. "Captain, you destroyed yourself the moment you decided that your prejudices were more important than basic human decency. I'm just ensuring that there are consequences for your actions." "But my family should have been considered before you assaulted me," Naomi interrupted. "Every action has consequences, Captain. You chose to hit me because you thought I was powerless to fight back. You were wrong." As the aircraft began its descent toward San Francisco, the full scope of the situation was beginning to sink in for everyone involved. Marcus Thompson's career was over, Bradley. Hartwell was facing potential professional consequences, and Atlantic Airways was about to experience the kind of crisis that could reshape an entire industry. But for Naomi Richards, this was just the beginning. She had spent 3 years quietly observing her airline from the shadows, and what she'd seen today had convinced her that subtle changes weren't enough. It was time for a revolution, and it was going to start the moment they touched down in San Francisco. The descent into San Francisco International Airport felt like a countdown to Armageddon. As the aircraft banked left over the Pacific, giving passengers a view of the Golden Gate Bridge, gleaming in the afternoon sun, the atmosphere in first class remained electric with tension. Marcus Thompson sat slumped in an empty seat, his captain's uniform now looking more like a costume from a play that had ended badly. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing, missed calls from his wife, his union representative reporters who had somehow gotten his number, and what appeared to be his own airline's legal department. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Rebecca Martinez speaking from the cockpit," came the announcement over the intercom. Her voice was steady, but carried an undercurrent of stress that hadn't been there during takeoff. "We're beginning our final approach into San Francisco. Please return to your seats and prepare for landing." Naomi noticed that Marcus flinched at the sound of his subordinate's voice taking command of his aircraft. The humiliation was complete, stripped of authority, facing federal charges, and listening to someone else land the plane he'd captained for the last time. Elena Rodriguez was still furiously scribbling notes, her legal mind cataloging every detail for what was shaping up to be the discrimination case of the decade. "Ms. Richards," she said quietly, "when we land, there are going to be federal agents waiting. I strongly recommend that you let me handle all communications with law enforcement until we can get you proper representation." "I appreciate that," Naomi replied, "but I have my own legal team. They should be arriving shortly." She glanced at her phone where a stream of messages from her corporate attorneys confirmed that they were already mobilizing. The Meridian Holdings legal department didn't mess around when their client and their meal ticket was threatened. James Morrison was juggling 3 different phone calls, speaking in rapid-fire bursts to editors and producers who were scrambling to get the story on air. "Yes, confirmed assault. No, not just any passenger, she owns the airline. I have video, multiple witnesses. This is going to be huge." Margaret O'Sullivan, meanwhile, had become an unlikely narrator for the passengers in economy class who were hanging on every word as she relayed what was happening in first class. Her teaching background served her well as she explained the situation with clarity and appropriate moral outrage. "In 40 years of education," she was saying, to a crowd of passengers who had gathered around her seat, "I've seen prejudice in many forms. But what that captain did was beyond the pale, absolutely beyond the pale." Bradley Hartwell had spent the descent trying to make himself invisible, hunched down in his seat and avoiding eye contact with anyone. His phone had also started ringing as word of the incident spread, and from what Naomi could overhear, his company was not pleased with the association. Atlantic Airways might not be his only problem. Corporate America had become increasingly sensitive to employees who generated negative publicity, especially around discrimination issues. As the plane touched down with a gentle bump and taxied toward the gate, Naomi could see through the windows that this wasn't going to be a normal arrival. FBI vehicles were positioned near the gate, along with what appeared to be several news vans and a crowd of airport security personnel. Word had clearly gotten out, and the media was ready to pounce. "Jesus," James Morrison muttered, peering out the window. "Looks like half the bureau is out there. And is that CNN?" "Channel 7 News, too," added another passenger who had been watching from economy. "This is going to be a circus." Marcus Thompson seemed to shrink further into his seat as he spotted the federal agents. "This is really happening," he whispered to himself. "They're really going to arrest me." "Captain," Elena Rodriguez said, not unkindly, "you need to understand that what you did constitutes multiple federal crimes: assault on an aircraft, interference with flight crew duties, civil rights violations under federal jurisdiction. You're looking at serious prison time." "But I never meant—" Marcus started, then stopped. What was the point? There was no walking back from what he'd done, no explanation that would make striking a passenger acceptable. As the aircraft came to a stop at the gate, First Officer Martinez's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats until we've been cleared by ground personnel. We have some unusual circumstances that require special procedures." Naomi stood up, smoothing down her hoodie and checking her reflection in her phone's camera. The mark from Marcus's slap was still visible on her cheek, a reddening handprint that would photograph well for the media circus awaiting her. She'd learned long ago that image management was crucial in moments like this. Ms. Richards, Jennifer the flight attendant, approached nervously. Airport security would like everyone involved in the incident to remain aboard until federal agents can take statements. Of course, Naomi replied. I'm happy to cooperate fully. Elena Rodriguez looked up from her notes. Just remember, you don't have to say anything without your attorney present. Even though you're the victim here, anything you say can potentially be used in both criminal and civil proceedings. Through the aircraft windows, Naomi could see federal agents boarding through the jet bridge. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of people who dealt with aviation crimes regularly, and she noticed they were accompanied by what appeared to be representatives from the airline's corporate security department. The first agent to enter the first-class cabin was a tall African-American woman in her 40s, wearing a crisp FBI windbreaker and carrying credentials that she displayed prominently. I'm Special Agent Sarah Washington, with the FBI's Transportation Security Division, she announced to the cabin. We're here to investigate reports of assault and civil rights violations aboard this aircraft. Her eyes swept the cabin, taking in the tense faces and obvious divisions among the passengers. When her gaze settled on Naomi, she nodded slightly, whether in recognition of her as the victim or acknowledgement of something else, it was hard to say. Ms. Richards, Agent Washington approached with professional courtesy. I understand you're the complainant in this incident. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention? I'm fine physically, Naomi replied, touching her cheek unconsciously. But I do want to press full charges against Captain Thompson for assault. Understood. We'll need to take a full statement, but first I need to secure the scene and ensure all witnesses are properly identified. Agent Washington's eyes moved to Marcus Thompson, who was now standing rigidly at attention, as if that might somehow restore his dignity. Captain Thompson, I'm placing you under arrest for assault under federal jurisdiction. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda warning proceeded, other agents moved through the cabin, quietly separating witnesses and beginning the process of evidence collection. James Morrison was asked to surrender his phone for examination, though he assured the agents that everything was already backed up to cloud storage. Elena Rodriguez presented her credentials and began coordinating with the agents about proper procedures for protecting her client's rights. Margaret O'Sullivan was interviewed as a primary witness, her teaching background making her an ideal narrator of events. Even Bradley Hartwell was questioned, though his responses were increasingly evasive, as he realized the depth of his legal exposure. Ms. Richards, Agent Washington said, returning after ensuring Marcus Thompson was properly processed. We're going to need extensive statements from you, but I understand you have legal representation coming. Can we coordinate a time for formal interviews? Absolutely, Naomi replied. My attorneys should be here within the hour. But Agent Washington, there's something else you should know about this situation. The FBI agent raised an eyebrow. What's that? Naomi pulled out her Meridian Holdings documentation again. I own this airline. This isn't just a passenger assault case. It's an issue of systemic discrimination within a company that I'm ultimately responsible for. Agent Washington's eyes widened slightly as she examined the corporate documents. Ms. Richards, are you telling me that you own Atlantic Airways and one of your own employees assaulted you? 73% controlling interest, Naomi confirmed. Captain Thompson didn't know that when he hit me, of course. He just saw a young black woman in first class and decided she didn't belong there. The implications hit Agent Washington immediately. This changes the scope of our investigation significantly. We're not just looking at individual criminal behavior, we're potentially looking at institutional civil rights violations. Exactly, Elena Rodriguez interjected. This incident is the tip of the iceberg. We believe there's a pattern of discriminatory behavior that the airline has failed to address. As the agents continued their work, word was spreading beyond the aircraft. Naomi's phone showed dozens of missed calls from reporters, business associates, and what appeared to be several members of Congress who served on transportation committees. The story was already breaking on social media, with hashtags like #airline assault and #flight from hell trending nationally. Ms. Richards, James Morrison approached with obvious excitement. I've just been contacted by the major networks. They want exclusive interviews. This story is exploding. It's already the lead story on 3 cable news channels. Naomi considered this carefully. Media attention could be a powerful tool for forcing change, but it could also spiral out of control if not managed properly. What kind of coverage are we looking at? Everything, James replied. Civil rights angle, corporate responsibility, federal aviation safety, systemic discrimination in the airline industry. This touches on every hot-button issue in America right now. Through the aircraft windows, Naomi could see the media presence growing by the minute. News trucks were lined up outside the terminal, satellite dishes deployed, and reporters were setting up for what appeared to be live broadcasts. Airport security was struggling to maintain order as crowds of curious passengers and airport workers gathered to watch the spectacle. Agent Washington, Naomi said. How long before we can disembark? I'd like to address the media while this is still fresh in people's minds. The FBI agent looked concerned. Ms. Richards, I'd strongly recommend against making any public statements until our investigation is complete. Anything you say could potentially compromise the criminal case. Elena Rodriguez nodded agreement. She's right. Let the legal process play out first, then we can control the narrative. But Naomi had been thinking about this differently. This isn't just about one criminal case, she said firmly. This is about changing an entire industry. Sometimes you have to risk short-term legal complications for long-term systemic change. Marcus Thompson, now handcuffed and flanked by federal agents, was being escorted off the aircraft. As he passed Naomi's seat, he stopped and turned to face her one last time. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the commotion in the cabin. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am genuinely sorry. Naomi studied his face, searching for signs of genuine remorse versus self-interested damage control. Captain Thompson, you're sorry you got caught. You're sorry you hit someone who turned out to have power. But you're not sorry about the years of discrimination that led to this moment. Marcus opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it. There was nothing he could say that would make any difference now. The agents led him away, and Naomi watched through the window as he was placed in a federal vehicle, his career and reputation disappearing with him into the California afternoon. Bradley Hartwell was next to be escorted off, though he wasn't under arrest yet. Federal agents wanted to question him about his role in creating the hostile environment that had led to the assault. As he gathered his belongings, he avoided looking at Naomi, but his pale complexion and shaking hands suggested he understood the gravity of his situation. Mr. Hartwell, Naomi called out as he passed. You might want to start thinking about how you're going to explain this to your employer and your family. He stopped, his shoulders sagging. I never meant for anyone to get hurt, he said, without turning around. But you did mean to put me in my place, Naomi replied. The hurt was inevitable once you decided I didn't deserve basic human respect. As the cabin gradually emptied of federal agents and most passengers, Naomi found herself in the strange position of being both victim and ultimate authority figure in the same incident. Her phone was now showing messages from Atlantic Airways executives who still had no idea they were texting their actual boss. David Chen, the CEO, had sent increasingly frantic messages asking for updates on the situation and offering various forms of compensation and accommodation. His desperation was palpable. He clearly understood that this incident could destroy the airline if not handled properly. "Elena," Naomi said to her impromptu attorney, "how quickly can we file both criminal and civil charges?" Elena Rodriguez looked up from her legal pad where she'd been outlining their strategy. "Criminal charges are already in motion. The FBI will handle that. Civil charges we can file within days, but I'd recommend waiting until we have a full picture of the institutional problems." "What do you mean?" "I mean, this incident suggests a pattern of discrimination that goes beyond one pilot's behavior. If we're going to sue Atlantic Airways, we want to sue them for everything: inadequate training, poor oversight, systemic bias, failure to address complaints. That requires investigation." Naomi smiled grimly. "Elena, I own the airline. I have access to every personnel file, every complaint, every training record. If there's a pattern of discrimination, I can find it." The realization hit Elena like a thunderbolt. "You're going to investigate your own company and then sue yourself." "I'm going to investigate my company, find the problems, and then use legal action to force the changes that should have been made years ago," Naomi corrected. "Sometimes the threat of massive liability is the only thing that motivates corporate boards to do the right thing." Margaret O'Sullivan, who had been listening to the conversation with growing admiration, shook her head in amazement. "Young lady, you are playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers." As the aircraft finally emptied of law enforcement and most passengers, Naomi prepared for the next phase of what was already being called the most significant discrimination case in aviation history. Through the windows, she could see reporters positioning themselves for her eventual emergence from the plane. The entire country was about to get a masterclass in how power really worked in corporate America. But first, she had a phone call to make. She dialed a number from memory one that would connect her directly to the emergency board meeting that was undoubtedly already underway at Atlantic Airways headquarters. "David Chen's office," came the voice of his assistant, clearly frazzled by the crisis unfolding around them. "This is Naomi Richards," she said calmly. "I need to speak with Mr. Chen immediately about the incident on Flight 847. "Oh, Ms. Richards." "Yes, Mr. Chen has been trying to reach you. He's in an emergency board meeting right now, but I'm sure he'll take your call. Please hold." As Naomi waited on hold, she could hear the distant sounds of raised voices and urgent conversations. The Atlantic Airways board was clearly in full crisis mode, probably discussing damage control strategies and liability exposure. What they didn't know was that their largest shareholder was about to walk into their meeting and turn their world upside down. "Ms. Richards," David Chen's voice was strained when he finally came on the line. "I cannot begin to express how sorry we are about what happened. This is completely unacceptable, and we're going to do everything in our power to make it right." "Mr. Chen," Naomi said, her voice carrying the authority that came with actual ownership, "I think it's time we met in person. I have some thoughts about how Atlantic Airways should handle this situation." "Of course, absolutely. Whatever you need. Should I send a car to pick you up?" "We can meet wherever is convenient for you." Naomi smiled. "Actually, I think I'll come to you. I understand you're in an emergency board meeting about this incident. I'd like to attend." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm not sure that's appropriate, Ms. Richards. These are internal company discussions about legal strategy and—" "Mr. Chen," Naomi interrupted. "I think you're going to want to hear what I have to say. Trust me on this." As she ended the call, Elena Rodriguez was watching her with fascination. "You're not just going to sue them," she realized. "You're going to take over completely. I already own them, Naomi replied, standing up and gathering her belongings. I'm just going to start acting like it. The media circus waiting outside was unlike anything San Francisco International Airport had ever seen. As Naomi prepared to disembark, she could see reporters from every major network positioning themselves for the money shot, the young black woman who had been assaulted by an airline captain, walking off the very plane where it happened. Ms. Richards. Agent Washington approached one final time. Are you sure you don't want to exit through a private route? We can arrange discreet transportation away from the media. Naomi considered this for a moment, then shook her head. Agent Washington, sometimes the best way to fight discrimination is to make sure everyone can see exactly what it looks like. I'm going to walk out that door and face every camera because the story needs to be told. Elena Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Just remember, keep your statements general. Don't get into specifics about legal strategy or company operations. As Naomi approached the aircraft door, she paused to look back at the first-class cabin where her life had changed forever. Seat 2A, where she'd been sitting when Marcus Thompson first challenged her right to be there. The aisle where he'd confronted her with increasing hostility. The spot where he'd finally snapped and committed the assault that would end his career and transform an entire industry. In a few hours, she'd be sitting in a boardroom full of executives who had no idea they were about to meet their boss. In a few days, she'd be testifying before federal investigators about systematic discrimination in her own company. In a few weeks, she'd be implementing changes that would ripple through the entire aviation industry. But right now, she was just a young black woman, walking off an airplane where she'd been assaulted for having the audacity to exist in a space where someone thought she didn't belong. The irony was perfect. Marcus Thompson had wanted to put her in her place. He was about to discover that her place was at the very top. As Naomi stepped off Flight 847 and into the glare of television lights and camera flashes, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had just won a war that the other side didn't even know they were fighting. The revolution was about to begin, and it was going to start with a simple truth: all wasn't about who you appeared to be, but about who you actually were. And Naomi Richards was about to show the world exactly who she was. The wall of camera flashes that greeted Naomi as she stepped off the aircraft was blinding, but she moved through it with the practiced grace of someone who had navigated hostile environments before. The cacophony of shouted questions from reporters created a din that echoed through the terminal, but she kept her expression calm and purposeful as she walked toward the waiting microphones. Ms. Richards. Ms. Richards. Can you tell us what happened on the flight? How do you feel about being assaulted by the captain? Is it true that you own Atlantic Airways? She stopped at the designated press area where airport security had established a perimeter to keep the media at a respectful distance. Elena Rodriguez flanked her on one side while James Morrison had positioned himself where he could capture everything for his exclusive coverage. Behind her, through the terminal windows, she could see the aircraft she'd just left now surrounded by federal investigators and airline officials. I'll make a brief statement, Naomi said, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd. The reporters immediately quieted, recognizing that they were about to get the soundbite that would lead every newscast for the next week. My name is Naomi Richards, and approximately 4 hours ago I was physically assaulted by Captain Marcus Thompson of Atlantic Airways while seated in first class on Flight 847 from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. She paused, letting the gravity of the statement sink in. This assault was preceded by a pattern of discriminatory behavior that began the moment I boarded the aircraft and took my assigned seat. A reporter from CNN pushed forward. Ms. Richards, can you describe the nature of the discrimination you experienced? Naomi's jaw tightened slightly. From the moment Captain Thompson saw me in first class, he questioned my right to be there. He suggested that I might be confused about my seating assignment, that I needed guidance to understand appropriate behavior, and that some passengers require more supervision than others. The racial undertones of these comments were unmistakable. What led to the actual assault? Called out a journalist from the Washington Post. I challenged his authority, Naomi replied simply. I refused to accept his discriminatory treatment, and I demonstrated knowledge of aviation regulations that apparently surprised him. When he realized he couldn't intimidate me with his position, he escalated to physical violence. The crowd of reporters erupted with follow-up questions, but Naomi held up a hand for silence. There's something else you need to understand about this situation, she continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. Captain Thompson didn't just assault a random passenger. He assaulted the majority owner of Atlantic Airways. The revelation sent a shockwave through the assembled media. Camera operators zoomed in for close-ups as reporters struggled to process this bombshell information. Elena Rodriguez had advised against revealing this detail, but Naomi understood the power of controlling the narrative from the very beginning. That's right, she continued as the crowd buzzed with excitement. Through Meridian Holdings LLC, I own 73% of Atlantic Airways. Captain Thompson struck his own boss, and he did it because he couldn't conceive of a young black woman having the right to sit in first class, let alone own the entire airline. A reporter from Fox News managed to shout over the din, "Ms. Richards, if you own the airline, doesn't that make you partly responsible for Captain Thompson's behavior?" It was exactly the question Naomi had been expecting, and she was ready for it. That's a fair question, and it's one I've been asking myself. The fact that someone like Marcus Thompson could rise to a senior position and maintain it for over 20 years suggests institutional problems that I clearly failed to identify and address. She looked directly into the CNN camera, knowing that her next words would be replayed endlessly. But that ends today. I'm announcing the immediate implementation of the Meridian Protocol, a comprehensive overhaul of Atlantic Airways hiring training and oversight procedures designed to eliminate discrimination at every level of the organization. Elena Rodriguez shot her a sharp look. This was the first she'd heard of any Meridian protocol. But Naomi was improvising brilliantly, using the media attention to commit her company to changes that the board would have no choice but to accept. "What exactly does the Meridian Protocol entail?" asked a reporter from the New York Times. "Complete transparency in hiring and promotion decisions, mandatory bias training for all employees, an independent oversight board with the authority to investigate discrimination complaints, and immediate termination for anyone found guilty of discriminatory behavior." Naomi's voice grew stronger with each word. "We're also implementing a victim compensation fund for anyone who has experienced discrimination while flying Atlantic Airways." The financial implications of what she was promising were staggering, and she could almost hear the Atlantic Airways board members watching this press conference having collective heart attacks. But sometimes you had to break a few eggs to make an omelet, and Naomi was prepared to crack every shell necessary to rebuild her airline's culture. "Ms. Richards," called out a local San Francisco reporter, "what's your message to other passengers who might have experienced similar treatment?" Naomi's expression softened slightly. "My message is that what happened to me was wrong, but it was not unique. Marcus Thompson didn't develop his prejudices overnight, and I doubt I was his first victim. I want every passenger who has been discriminated against by Atlantic Airways to come forward. We're establishing a hotline and a dedicated legal team to handle these cases." "Are you saying the airline has a systemic discrimination problem?" pressed the CNN reporter. "I'm saying that today's incident has opened my eyes to failures in our corporate culture that I should have identified and corrected years ago," Naomi replied. But I'm also saying that we're going to fix them even if it means rebuilding the company from the ground up. As the press conference continued, Naomi became aware of a commotion behind the media scrum. David Chen, the Atlantic Airways CEO, had arrived with what appeared to be half the company's senior management team. They were standing at the edge of the crowd, their faces reflecting various degrees of panic and confusion as they watched their supposed customer dictating corporate policy to the national media. Chen was a tall, thin man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of nervous energy that came from managing a crisis he didn't fully understand. Naomi could see him conferring urgently with his legal team, probably trying to figure out how to contain the damage she was currently inflicting on his company's reputation and stock price. "Ms. Richards," shouted a reporter from Bloomberg, "what's your response to critics who might say you're using this incident for personal gain or publicity?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Naomi knew her answer would be dissected by every pundit and legal analyst in the country. She took a moment to compose her thoughts, aware that this might be the most important statement of her life. "Getting slapped in the face on a commercial flight is not my idea of effective marketing," she said, drawing nervous laughter from the crowd. "But now that it's happened, I have a choice. I can accept a private settlement, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and let the system continue to protect people like Marcus Thompson. Or I can use my position to force changes that will protect every passenger who doesn't have the power to fight back." She paused, her eyes scanning the faces of the reporters who were hanging on every word. "I choose to fight. Not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been made to feel that they don't belong in a space they paid to occupy." The power of the statement was undeniable, and Naomi could see several reporters already crafting the headlines that would make her the face of corporate accountability and civil rights enforcement. But she also knew that the real work was just beginning. "I'll take one more question," she announced, as the crowd surged forward with raised hands. "Ms. Richards," called out a reporter from USA Today, "what happens to Captain Thompson now?" Naomi's expression hardened. "Captain Thompson is facing federal charges for assault, civil rights violations, and interference with airline operations. His career is over and he's likely looking at significant prison time. But more importantly, his case is going to send a message throughout the aviation industry that discrimination has consequences." She stepped back from the microphones, but the reporters weren't finished. Questions continued to fly as security personnel began clearing a path for her to leave. Elena Rodriguez moved closer, speaking quietly in her ear. "That was brilliant," the attorney murmured, "but you just committed your company to potentially hundreds of millions in liability." "Good," Naomi replied. "Maybe that's what it takes to get their attention." As they moved through the terminal, Naomi became aware that David Chen was approaching with obvious desperation. His face was flushed and she could see sweat stains on his expensive shirt, despite the air conditioning. The man was clearly in full panic mode. "Ms. Richards," he called out, slightly out of breath from hurrying across the terminal, "we need to talk. Immediately." Naomi stopped and turned to face him, noting with interest that several of his senior staff members were trailing behind him like lost puppies. "Mr. Chen," she said pleasantly, "I was just telling the media about some exciting changes coming to Atlantic Airways." "Yes, I heard," Chen replied through gritted teeth. "That's exactly what we need to discuss, in private." "Of course," Naomi agreed. "I assume you have conference facilities here at the airport." "We've arranged a private meeting room," Chen confirmed, gesturing toward a corridor that led away from the main terminal. "If you could just—" But Naomi held up a hand. "Before we go anywhere, Mr. Chen, I think you should know that I'm not traveling alone." She gestured to Elena Rodriguez. "This is my attorney, Elena Rodriguez." She'll be joining us for any discussions about how Atlantic Airways plans to handle this situation. Chen's face went pale. Ms. Richards, I was hoping we could have a more informal conversation. Attorney involvement tends to complicate these situations. Mr. Chen, Naomi replied sweetly. Your employee assaulted me 4 hours ago. The situation is already complicated. The walk to the conference room was conducted in tense silence, with Chen and his team exchanging nervous glances while Naomi maintained the serene composure of someone holding all the cards. James Morrison had managed to attach himself to the group ostensibly as media escort, but really to ensure he didn't miss any part of what was shaping up to be the business story of the year. The conference room was sterile and corporate, with a long table surrounded by leather chairs and a wall-mounted television currently showing CNN's coverage of the press conference. Naomi noted with amusement that her face was prominently displayed on the screen, with a chyron reading, "Airline owner assaulted by captain." Chen moved to turn off the television, but Naomi stopped him. "Leave it on," she said. "I want to see how this story is playing." As they took their seats, Chen attempted to regain control of the situation. Ms. Richards, before we begin, I want to personally apologize for what happened to you today. Captain Thompson's behavior was completely unacceptable, and Atlantic Airways takes full responsibility. Do you? Naomi asked, settling into her chair with the air of someone preparing for a performance. Because from what I observed, Captain Thompson's behavior appeared to be part of a broader cultural problem within your organization. Chen's legal counsel, a nervous-looking woman in her 40s, leaned forward. Ms. Richards, we understand you're upset, and rightfully so. We're prepared to offer a substantial settlement to resolve this matter quickly and quietly. Elena Rodriguez laughed, actually laughed out loud. Counselor, I don't think you understand the situation here. Your client just offered to pay off the woman who owns your company. The statement hit the Atlantic Airways team like a physical blow. Chen's mouth fell open, his legal counsel went white, and the other executives began whispering urgently among themselves. Clearly, none of them had been watching the press conference closely enough to catch that particular bombshell. I'm sorry, Chen stammered. Did you say she owns Atlantic Airways? Naomi reached into her bag and produced the same corporate documents she'd shown on the aircraft. 73% controlling interest through Meridian Holdings LLC, she confirmed, sliding the papers across the table. I've been your majority shareholder for 3 years, Mr. Chen. The silence that followed was deafening. Chen stared at the documents as if they might be forgeries, while his legal team frantically cross-referenced the corporate structure on their phones. The reality was slowly sinking in that they were dealing with their actual boss, not just an angry customer. This is impossible, Chen finally whispered. Meridian Holdings is managed by a law firm in Delaware. We've never met the actual beneficial owner. By design, Naomi replied. I prefer to observe how my companies operate when they think no one is watching. Today's experience has been very enlightening. Elena Rodriguez was enjoying the spectacle immensely. Gentlemen, let me explain the situation clearly. Ms. Richards owns your airline. Your employee assaulted her based on racial prejudice. She has evidence of systematic discrimination within your organization. And she just announced changes to company policy on national television. She smiled predatorily. You're not here to negotiate a settlement. You're here to receive instructions. Chen looked like he might be sick. Ms. Richards, if you've been the majority shareholder for 3 years, why didn't you intervene before this? Why didn't you address these cultural issues through normal corporate channels? It was a fair question, and Naomi had been asking herself the same thing. Because I believed that hiring good people and setting clear policies would be enough. I assumed that basic human decency was the default setting for airline employees. Her voice hardened. Today taught me that assumption was wrong. James Morrison, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the exchange, looked up from his notebook. Mr. Chen, were you aware that Captain Thompson had a history of discriminatory behavior? Chen and his team exchanged uncomfortable glances. We're not able to discuss personnel matters, his legal counsel replied quickly. Actually, Naomi interjected, I think we are. Since I own the company, I'm ordering you to provide a complete review of Captain Thompson's employment history, including any complaints or disciplinary actions. The request put Chen in an impossible position. He couldn't refuse a direct order from his majority shareholder, but revealing Thompson's personnel file might expose the company to additional liability. After a moment of internal struggle, he nodded to one of his assistants, who began making phone calls. Ms. Richards, Chen said carefully, I think we need to discuss the financial implications of the policy changes you announced. The Victim Compensation Fund alone could cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Then we'll spend hundreds of millions of dollars, Naomi replied without hesitation. Mr. Chen, this company generates over $8 billion in annual revenue. We can afford to do the right thing. But the shareholders, I am the shareholders, Naomi interrupted. 73% of them anyway. And I'm telling you that profitability is less important than making sure this never happens again. Elena Rodriguez was taking notes, furiously documenting every admission and commitment for the legal proceedings that were surely coming. Mr. Chen, she said, I'm curious about your company's training procedures. What kind of bias awareness education do your employees receive? Chen looked to his HR director, a middle-aged man who had been silent throughout the meeting. We have diversity and inclusion modules that all employees complete annually, he said hesitantly. Modules, Naomi repeated flatly. Online training videos that people click through without paying attention. Well, they do have to pass a quiz. Mr. Chen. Naomi stood up abruptly, her patience finally exhausted. Here's what's going to happen. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. We're going to review every aspect of Atlantic Airways' employment practices, training procedures, and complaint handling processes. Then we're going to fix them. Ms. Richards, Chen said desperately, the board meets quarterly. We can't just… Mr. Chen. Naomi's voice carried the authority of someone who was done playing games. I own this company. I can call a board meeting whenever I want, and I can replace every member of that board if they don't like it. The threat hung in the air like a sword over Chen's head. He was beginning to understand that his comfortable position as CEO was entirely dependent on the goodwill of a woman he'd never met, who had just been assaulted by one of his employees. Of course, he said quickly. Monday morning, whatever you need. Good, Naomi replied. Now I want that review of Captain Thompson's personnel file within the hour. I want a complete list of any discrimination complaints filed against Atlantic Airways employees in the past 5 years. And I want detailed proposals for implementing every change I announced at the press conference. She moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Chen, you might want to start preparing your resume. I'm not convinced that someone who allowed this culture to flourish is the right person to fix it. As Naomi left the stunned airline executives behind, Elena Rodriguez caught up with her in the corridor. That was incredible, the attorney said, barely containing her excitement. You just took control of a Fortune 500 company in 15 minutes. I already controlled it, Naomi corrected. I just decided to start acting like it. James Morrison was practically vibrating with journalistic excitement. Ms. Richards, this story just keeps getting bigger. A secret billionaire reveals herself after being assaulted by her own employee, then uses the incident to restructure an entire industry. This is Pulitzer Prize material. As they walked through the terminal, Naomi became aware that word of her identity had spread beyond the immediate media coverage. Passengers and airport employees were staring at her with a mixture of curiosity and awe. She was no longer just the victim of an airline assault. She was a powerful businesswoman who had just publicly committed to changing an entire industry. "Ms. Richards," Elena said quietly, "we need to talk about next steps. The FBI investigation, the civil suit, the corporate restructuring, it's a lot to coordinate." "I know," Naomi replied, "but sometimes you have to move fast before the other side can organize their defenses. By the time Atlantic Airways board figures out what's happening, the changes will already be implemented." Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Richards, this is Rebecca Martinez, the first officer from your flight. I want you to know that what Captain Thompson did was wrong, and many of us have been hoping someone would finally hold him accountable. If you need witnesses to his past behavior, I can provide them." Naomi showed the message to Elena, who whistled softly. "It's starting already. The floodgates are about to open." As they exited the airport into the San Francisco afternoon, Naomi could see that the media presence had only grown larger. News trucks lined the departure area, and she could spot reporters from major networks setting up for live broadcasts. The story was clearly resonating beyond just aviation industry news. This was becoming a national conversation about discrimination, corporate accountability, and the abuse of power. "Ms. Richards," called out a reporter from ABC News as they approached the waiting cars. "What's your message to other victims of workplace discrimination?" Naomi paused, considering the question carefully. This might be her last opportunity to shape the narrative before the story took on a life of its own. "My message is simple," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd. "Power isn't about the position you hold or the uniform you wear. It's about your willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Today, I had the privilege of power, the power to fight back, to demand accountability, to force change. But that power comes with responsibility." She looked directly into the camera. "I'm responsible for ensuring that every passenger, regardless of their race, gender, or background, is treated with dignity and respect. I'm responsible for making sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. And I'm responsible for proving that sometimes, just sometimes, the system can work for justice instead of against it." As Naomi climbed into the waiting car, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the space of a single flight. 6 hours ago, she'd been an anonymous billionaire traveling incognito to observe her company's operations. Now she was the face of a national movement, committed to restructuring an entire industry and facing down the consequences of decades of institutional discrimination. The car pulled away from the airport, but through the rear window she could see the media circus continuing. James Morrison was already on the phone with his editors, Elena Rodriguez was coordinating with federal investigators, and somewhere in the city, David Chen was probably having the worst day of his professional life. But for Naomi Richards, this was just the beginning. The real work, the hard grinding effort of actually changing corporate culture and rebuilding an airline's soul was still ahead. Marcus Thompson had wanted to put her in her place. Instead, he'd put her exactly where she needed to be, in a position to change everything. The revolution had begun, and there was no going back. The black sedan moved through San Francisco's evening traffic, with the weight of history settling around its passengers. Naomi stared out the window at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk, her mind already racing ahead to the corporate boardroom confrontation that would reshape Atlantic Airways forever. The mark on her cheek had faded to a dull ache, but the fire in her eyes burned brighter than ever. Elena Rodriguez was furiously typing on her laptop, coordinating with federal investigators, and preparing legal documents that would fundamentally alter how discrimination cases were prosecuted in the aviation industry. Every few minutes, her phone buzzed with calls from major law firms offering to join the case, civil rights organizations pledging support, and reporters seeking exclusive interviews. "The FBI wants to schedule a formal deposition for tomorrow morning," Elena said, without looking up from her screen. "And I've just received word that the Department of Transportation is launching a comprehensive investigation into Atlantic Airways' employment practices." "Good," Naomi replied, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone watching carefully laid plans come to fruition. "The more scrutiny, the better. Sunlight is the best disinfectant." James Morrison, who had been granted exclusive access to document this historic moment, looked up from his own notes. "Ms. Richards, I've been covering corporate scandals for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this. You're not just changing one company, you're rewriting the rules for an entire industry." The car pulled up to the towering glass headquarters of Atlantic Airways in downtown San Francisco. Even at this late hour, the building was blazing with lights as executives worked frantically to manage the crisis that had erupted around them. Through the lobby windows, Naomi could see security guards and what appeared to be more federal agents setting up equipment for what promised to be a very long night. "Ms. Richards," Elena said, as they prepared to exit the vehicle. "Once we walk through those doors, there's no going back. You're about to trigger the largest corporate restructuring in aviation history." Naomi smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. "Elena, there was no going back the moment Marcus Thompson decided to hit me. He just didn't know it yet." The lobby of Atlantic Airways headquarters was a temple to corporate success, with soaring ceilings, marble floors, and massive photographs of aircraft in flight. But tonight, it felt more like a mausoleum filled with the ghosts of decisions that had led inexorably to this moment of reckoning. David Chen was waiting near the elevators, flanked by what appeared to be every senior executive the company could muster on short notice. His face was ashen, and the confident corporate leader who had tried to manage Naomi earlier had been replaced by a man who clearly understood that his career was hanging by a thread. "Ms. Richards," he said, as she approached, his voice carefully modulated to project calm authority he clearly didn't feel. "The board is assembled and waiting for your presentation." "My presentation?" Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Chen, I think you misunderstand the nature of this meeting. I'm not here to present anything to the board. I'm here to inform them of decisions that have already been made." The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was conducted in tense silence, with Chen and his executives exchanging nervous glances, while Naomi maintained the serene composure of someone who owned everything around them. Elena Rodriguez was reviewing her legal notes one final time, preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most important corporate confrontation of her career. The boardroom was exactly what Naomi had expected: mahogany paneling, leather chairs, and oil paintings of Atlantic Airways founder, and various corporate milestones. Around the massive conference table sat 12 of the most powerful people in the aviation industry, all of them trying to project confidence while internally panicking about the crisis that threatened to destroy everything they'd built. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chen announced as they entered, "I'd like you to meet Naomi Richards, who has some concerns about today's incident that she'd like to discuss." The understatement was so absurd that Elena Rodriguez actually snorted with laughter. "Mr. Chen," she said, "you really need to stop thinking of Ms. Richards as a concerned passenger. She's your boss." Robert Harrison, the board's chairman, and a man whose aviation career spanned 4 decades, looked up from the documents he'd been studying. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some confusion. Meridian Holdings LLC is represented by a law firm in Delaware. We've never met the beneficial owner. Naomi took her seat at the head of the table, a position that technically belonged to Harrison, but which she claimed with the quiet authority of actual ownership. Mr. Harrison, you've been working for me for 3 years. You just didn't know it. She placed her corporate documents on the table, and Harrison's face went white as he examined the stock certificates and ownership records. Around the table, board members leaned forward to get a better look, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock to something approaching terror. 73% controlling interest. Harrison read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Richards, this means you could replace this entire board if you wanted to. Yes, Naomi replied simply. I could. The question is whether I need to. Margaret Chen, the board's lead independent director, and no relation to the CEO, was studying Naomi with professional interest. Ms. Richards, with respect, if you've been our majority shareholder for 3 years, why are we just meeting you now? And why under these circumstances? It was the question Naomi had been preparing for, the one that would define how history remembered this moment. Ms. Chen, I believed that good people, given clear policies and proper oversight, would naturally do the right thing. Today's events have shown me that belief was naive. She stood up, her presence filling the room despite her casual attire. Captain Marcus Thompson didn't develop his prejudices overnight. The culture that allowed him to rise to a senior position and maintain it for over 20 years is the product of systematic failures at every level of this organization. Harrison was frantically reviewing Thompson's personnel file on his tablet. Ms. Richards, I'm seeing here that Captain Thompson has received several commendations for safety and professionalism. His record appears exemplary. Keep reading, Elena Rodriguez interjected. Check the complaint log. Harrison's expression grew increasingly troubled as he scrolled through the documents. There are 7 formal complaints filed against Captain Thompson over the past 5 years. Allegations of discriminatory behavior, inappropriate comments, hostile treatment of passengers. And what actions were taken in response to these complaints? Naomi asked, though she already knew the answer. It appears they were all dismissed as unsubstantiated or resolved through informal counseling. Harrison admitted, his voice growing weaker with each word. 7 complaints, Naomi repeated, letting the number hang in the air. 7 passengers who took the time and effort to formally document discriminatory treatment, and your response was to give their abuser a few counseling sessions. Sandra Williams, the board's diversity and inclusion specialist, was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Ms. Richards, we have comprehensive policies against discrimination. All employees receive annual training, online modules, Naomi interrupted. 20-minute videos that employees click through without paying attention, followed by multiple-choice quizzes that a child could pass. She began pacing around the table, her energy crackling through the room like electricity. Ladies and gentlemen, today I was physically assaulted by one of your senior employees because he couldn't accept the sight of a young black woman in first class. This assault was witnessed by multiple passengers, recorded on video, and will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. The board members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly aware that they were witnessing the destruction of everything they'd worked to build. Chen had his head in his hands, probably calculating the cost of the lawsuits that were surely coming. But here's what's really disturbing, Naomi continued, her voice gaining power with each word. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the inevitable result of a culture that has consistently prioritized the comfort of employees like Marcus Thompson over the dignity of passengers like me. Elena Rodriguez opened her laptop and began projecting documents onto the room's large screen. We've conducted a preliminary analysis of discrimination complaints filed against Atlantic Airways over the past 5 years. The patterns are disturbing. The data was damning. Complaints disproportionately involved passengers of color being questioned about their right to premium seating, facing additional scrutiny during security procedures, or receiving substandard service. Most complaints were dismissed without investigation, and repeat offenders like Thompson faced no meaningful consequences. This is not just a public relations problem, Elena continued. This represents massive legal liability under federal civil rights statutes. Every one of these complaints could result in significant financial penalties and punitive damages. Harrison was studying the projections with growing horror. How many potential plaintiffs are we talking about? Based on our preliminary review, potentially hundreds, Elena replied. And once this story breaks nationally, we expect many more victims to come forward. Thomas Bradley, the board's finance committee chair, spoke up for the first time. Ms. Richards, what are the financial implications of the changes you announced at the airport? Naomi had been waiting for this question, knowing it would reveal the true priorities of the people who had been running her company. Mr. Bradley, are you asking me to put a price tag on basic human dignity? No, of course not. Bradley backtracked quickly. I'm asking about the practical implementation of these reforms. The Victim Compensation Fund alone could cost hundreds of millions of dollars, Naomi finished. Yes, I'm aware. We're going to spend whatever it takes to make this right. She returned to her seat at the head of the table, fixing each board member with a steady gaze. Ladies and gentlemen, Atlantic Airways generates over $8 billion in annual revenue. We can afford to do the right thing, and we're going to start doing it immediately. Ms. Richards, Harrison said carefully, implementing changes of this magnitude will require shareholder approval, regulatory review, union negotiations. Mr. Harrison. Naomi's voice carried a note of finality that silenced the room. I am the shareholders, 73% of them anyway. As for regulatory review, the Department of Transportation and FBI are already conducting investigations that will likely mandate these changes anyway. And if the unions object to eliminating discrimination, then we'll have identified another problem that needs solving. Elena Rodriguez was taking notes, furiously documenting every commitment and statement for the legal proceedings that were surely coming. Ms. Richards has prepared a comprehensive implementation plan, she announced, distributing thick packets to each board member. The plan was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. Every aspect of Atlantic Airways operations would be reviewed and restructured, from hiring and training procedures to complaint handling and employee accountability. The financial commitment was staggering, but the moral imperative was undeniable. This is essentially rebuilding the company from scratch, Margaret Chen observed, flipping through the pages. That's exactly what it is, Naomi confirmed. Because the company we have now produced Marcus Thompson, and that's unacceptable. David Chen finally looked up from his hands, his face reflecting the resignation of a man who knew his time was up. Ms. Richards, I think it's clear that new leadership is needed to implement these changes. I'll submit my resignation effective immediately. Naomi studied him for a long moment, recognizing both the courage it took to admit failure and the political calculation behind getting ahead of an inevitable firing. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Chen. I'll accept your resignation, but I want you to stay on for 90 days to ensure a smooth transition. Who will replace him? Harrison asked, though his tone suggested he suspected the answer. For now, I will, Naomi replied. Atlantic Airways needs leadership that's fully committed to these changes, and I'm the only person in this room with the authority to guarantee they'll be implemented. The announcement sent another shockwave through the boardroom. Elena Rodriguez smiled approvingly. She'd been advising Naomi to take direct control of the company rather than working through intermediaries who might water down her reforms. "Ms. Richards," Sandra Williams said hesitantly, "running an airline is incredibly complex. The regulatory requirements alone are manageable with good advisors and competent staff," Naomi finished. "I didn't become a billionaire by accident, Ms. Williams. I understand complex organizations." James Morrison, who had been quietly documenting everything from the corner of the room, looked up from his notes. "Ms. Richards, this is unprecedented. A discrimination victim taking over the company that employed her attacker and using that position to restructure an entire industry." "Sometimes precedent isn't enough," Naomi replied. "Sometimes you have to create new models for how justice works." Her phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced at it with growing satisfaction. "That's interesting," she said, showing the screen to Elena. "The FBI has just arrested Bradley Hartwell, the passenger who encouraged Captain Thompson's behavior. Apparently, conspiracy to violate civil rights is also a federal crime." The news sent another ripple of shock through the boardroom. If a passenger could face federal charges for supporting discrimination, the legal exposure for airline employees and executives was potentially limitless. "Ladies and gentlemen," Naomi stood up again, her energy commanding the room's attention. "What happened on Flight 847 was not an isolated incident. It was the logical conclusion of decades of institutional racism that this board allowed to flourish unchecked. Today, that ends." She moved to the window, gazing out at the city lights spreading across the San Francisco Bay. 6 months from now, Atlantic Airways will be the gold standard for inclusive aviation. Every employee will understand that discrimination has consequences. Every passenger will know they can fly with dignity and respect. And every airline in the world will be scrambling to match our standards. Harrison was studying the implementation timeline with growing amazement. "Ms. Richards, this is the most ambitious corporate restructuring I've ever seen. The scope is incredible." "The scope is necessary," Naomi corrected. "Incremental change wasn't working. Marcus Thompson proved that. Sometimes you have to tear down a broken system and build something better." Elena Rodriguez closed her laptop and addressed the board directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to be very clear about the legal situation. Ms. Richards has grounds for massive civil suits against this company, potentially in the hundreds of millions of dollars. She's choosing instead to use her ownership position to implement reforms that will prevent future incidents." But, she continued, her voice taking on a harder edge, "this generosity extends only to Atlantic Airways. Captain Thompson, Mr. Hartwell, and anyone else who contributed to today's assault will face the full force of federal prosecution. There will be no corporate protection, no legal defense funds, no settlements." Margaret Chen nodded slowly. "So the choice is between corporate reform and corporate destruction." "That's exactly right," Naomi confirmed. "And I'm hoping you'll choose reform." Thomas Bradley was still studying the financial projections with obvious concern. "Ms. Richards, the Victim Compensation Fund, will require significant capital expenditure. Our shareholders—" "Mr. Bradley," Naomi's voice carried a note of warning, "I am the shareholders, and I'm telling you that our company's reputation and moral standing are worth more than short-term profit margins." She returned to her seat, her presence dominating the room despite her casual attire. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you have a choice. You can support these reforms and help build something unprecedented in corporate America. Or you can resist them and find yourselves replaced by people who understand that the old ways of doing business are over." The silence that followed was deafening. Around the table, 12 of the most powerful executives in aviation were grappling with the reality that their industry was about to be fundamentally transformed by a young black woman who had been assaulted in first class. Finally, Harrison spoke. "Ms. Richards, on behalf of the board, I want to formally apologize for the institutional failures that led to today's incident. We pledge our full support for the Meridian Protocol and the changes you've outlined." "Thank you," Naomi replied, though her expression suggested that words alone wouldn't be sufficient. "But I need more than apologies. I need commitment. I need every person in this room to understand that your careers, your reputations, and your legacies depend on making these reforms succeed." Elena Rodriguez was watching the board members' faces, carefully cataloging their reactions for future reference. Some seemed genuinely committed to change, while others appeared to be calculating the political angles. All of them understood that their comfortable world had just been turned upside down. "The implementation begins tomorrow," Naomi announced. "I'm establishing a direct reporting structure that bypasses traditional corporate hierarchy. Every discrimination complaint will come directly to my office. Every employee involved in discriminatory behavior will face immediate investigation. And every passenger who has been mistreated by Atlantic Airways will have access to our Victim Compensation Fund." She stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "Ladies and gentlemen, 6 hours ago I was just another passenger trying to get to San Francisco. Tonight, I'm the face of a movement that will reshape how corporate America treats discrimination. Marcus Thompson thought he was putting me in my place. Instead, he put me exactly where I needed to be to change everything." As the board members filed out of the room, their faces reflecting various degrees of shock and resignation, Elena Rodriguez turned to Naomi with obvious admiration. "That was masterful," she said. "You just engineered the largest corporate accountability victory in modern history." "This is just the beginning," Naomi replied, watching through the window as news vans continued to arrive outside the building. "The real work starts tomorrow." James Morrison was already on the phone with his editor, describing the unprecedented scenes he'd just witnessed. "This isn't just a business story anymore," he was saying. "This is a fundamental shift in how corporate power can be used for social justice." As they prepared to leave the boardroom, Naomi's phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Marcus Thompson's wife, and after a moment's hesitation, she answered. "Mrs. Thompson," she said gently. "Miss Richards," came a tearful voice. "I just wanted to say how sorry I am for what my husband did. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to know that not everyone in our family shares his views." "I appreciate that," Naomi replied. "Your husband's actions were his own choice, and you bear no responsibility for them." "He's destroyed our family," Mrs. Thompson continued. 23 years of marriage, and I find out that he's capable of—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Mrs. Thompson, your husband's prejudices didn't develop overnight. This incident just made them visible." There was a long pause before Mrs. Thompson spoke again. "Ms. Richards, I know you have every right to hate him, to want him to suffer for what he did. But I have to ask, is there any chance for redemption, any possibility of forgiveness?" Naomi considered the question carefully. "Mrs. Thompson, forgiveness isn't mine to grant. Your husband assaulted me, but more importantly, he represented a system that has harmed countless people who didn't have the power to fight back. If he wants redemption, he needs to earn it from all of us." After ending the call, Naomi stood quietly in the empty boardroom, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 12 hours ago, she'd been an anonymous billionaire playing corporate observer. Now she was the face of a national movement committed to changes that would ripple through every corner of American business. Elena Rodriguez packed up her legal materials, already planning the next phase of what promised to be the most significant civil rights case of the decade. "Naomi," she said, "you realize there's no going back now. You've committed to rebuilding an entire industry." "Good," Naomi replied, her reflection in the window showing a woman transformed by purpose. "Because the industry we had produced Marcus Thompson, and that was unacceptable." As they left Atlantic Airways headquarters, Naomi could see that the media presence had grown even larger. News trucks from every major network lined the street, and she could spot reporters from international outlets preparing for live broadcasts. The story was no longer just American news, it was becoming a global conversation about corporate accountability and social justice. "Ms. Richards," called out a reporter from the BBC as they emerged from the building, "what's your message to discrimination victims around the world?" Naomi paused on the steps, looking out at the crowd of journalists and camera crews who would carry her words around the globe. "My message is that power isn't about the position you hold or the uniform you wear. It's about your willingness to use whatever influence you have to protect people who can't protect themselves." She looked directly into the cameras. "Today I had the privilege of power, the power to fight back, to demand justice, to force change. But that power comes with responsibility. I'm responsible for ensuring that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. And I'm responsible for proving that sometimes, just sometimes, the system can work for justice instead of against it." 6 months later, Naomi Richards stood in the same first-class cabin where Marcus Thompson had assaulted her, but everything had changed. The aircraft was part of Atlantic Airways' new fleet, equipped with state-of-the-art anti-discrimination monitoring systems, and staffed by employees who had completed the most comprehensive bias training program in aviation history. Captain Sarah Chen, no relation to the former CEO, was conducting the pre-flight briefing with professionalism that was both competent and genuinely inclusive. The first-class passengers represented every demographic imaginable, and all were treated with identical respect and courtesy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Chen announced, "this is your captain speaking. On behalf of Atlantic Airways, I want to welcome you aboard Flight 847 to San Francisco. This route holds special significance for our airline as it represents our commitment to ensuring that every passenger travels with dignity and respect." Naomi smiled from her seat 2A, the same seat where her journey had begun, and reflected on the changes that had swept through not just Atlantic Airways, but the entire aviation industry. The Meridian Protocol had become the gold standard for corporate anti-discrimination policies adopted by airlines around the world. The Victim Compensation Fund had paid out over $400 million to passengers who had experienced discrimination, and the money had been accompanied by personal apologies and commitments to systemic change. Marcus Thompson had been sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and banned from ever working in aviation again. Bradley Hartwell had received 18 months and been terminated from his position home at a major consulting firm. But more importantly, their cases had established legal precedents that made discrimination in transportation a high-risk, high-consequence crime. Elena Rodriguez, now serving as Atlantic Airways' chief legal officer, settled into the seat beside Naomi. "The Department of Transportation called this morning," she said. "They want to use our training protocols as the model for new federal regulations." "Good," Naomi replied, watching through the window as ground crews prepared for departure. "The more airlines that adopt these standards, the better." James Morrison, whose coverage of the incident had won him a Pulitzer Prize, was traveling with them to document the 6th-month anniversary of what the media had dubbed the flight that changed everything. His book about the incident had become a bestseller, with proceeds donated to civil rights organizations. "Ms. Richards," he said, settling into his seat across the aisle. "Looking back, Do you have any regrets about how you handled the situation? Naomi considered the question seriously. I regret that it took an assault to open my eyes to problems that had been festering for years. I regret that Marcus Thompson felt comfortable expressing his prejudices because he thought there would be no consequences. But I don't regret fighting back. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, Naomi reflected on the broader implications of her journey. The incident had sparked congressional hearings on discrimination in transportation, led to new federal legislation strengthening civil rights protections, and inspired corporate reform movements across multiple industries. But perhaps most importantly, it had shown that individual courage, when backed by institutional power, could create systemic change. Naomi had used her position not for personal revenge, but for collective justice. She had proven that corporate accountability was possible when leaders were willing to prioritize moral responsibility over financial convenience. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Chen speaking, came the announcement as they reached cruising altitude. I want to take a moment to recognize a special passenger aboard today's flight. 6 months ago, Naomi Richards experienced discrimination and assault aboard this very route. Her courage in fighting back has transformed our industry and made aviation safer and more inclusive for everyone. The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause, and Naomi felt a mixture of pride and humility at the recognition. She had never sought to become a symbol of social justice, but sometimes history chose its heroes rather than the other way around. Elena Rodriguez leaned over with a smile. You know, Marcus Thompson thought he was putting you in your place when he hit you. Naomi looked out the window at the clouds passing below, thinking about the journey that had brought her from victim to victor, from silent observer to active change agent. He did put me in my place, she replied. He just didn't realize that my place was at the top, fighting for everyone who couldn't fight for themselves. As Flight 847 continued its journey to San Francisco, carrying passengers who could travel with dignity and respect, because one woman had refused to accept discrimination, Naomi Richards understood that sometimes the most important destinations weren't geographic. Sometimes they were moral. Sometimes they were about arriving at a place where justice was possible, where accountability was real, and where the arc of the universe truly did bend toward equality. The flight that had begun with an assault had ended with a revolution, and the revolution was just getting started. Marcus Thompson had wanted to teach Naomi Richards a lesson about knowing her place. Instead, he had learned that her place was wherever she chose to make it, and what she had chosen to make was a world where no one else would have to endure what she had experienced. The slap that was meant to silence her had instead given voice to millions. The discrimination that was meant to diminish her had instead elevated her to heights she never could have imagined. And the system that was supposed to protect people like Marcus Thompson had instead been transformed to protect people like everyone else. As the aircraft descended toward San Francisco International Airport, the same airport where Naomi's public journey had begun, she realized that some circles weren't meant to be completed. They were meant to be broken, so that new and better paths could be forged. The revolution that began at 30,000 feet had landed, and the world would never be the same.